At 11:55 on the morning of October 13, 1942, Captain Joe Foss sat in the cockpit of a fighter plane that smelled like a swamp. The air on Guadalcanal was heavy, less like air and more like a hot, wet blanket wrapped around your face, thick with rotting jungle vegetation, high-octane aviation fuel, and the unwashed bodies of thousands of Marines who hadn't seen a bar of soap in 2 months. Foss was sweating, and the sweat ran down his back, soaked his flight suit, and dripped off his nose onto the instrument panel, but he didn't wipe it away because his hands were busy checking the controls of a machine that shouldn't have been flying at all. The plane was a Grumman F4F Wildcat, on paper the United States Navy's frontline fighter, but in reality, the specific aircraft Foss was sitting in was a wreck. The aluminum skin was patched with scrap metal where bullet holes had punched through the week before. The tires were worn bald, and the engine coughed and sputtered like an old tractor left out in the rain. It rattled at idle and leaked oil onto the runway. To the mechanics who worked on it 18 hours a day, it wasn't a weapon of war. It was a Frankenstein, a collection of spare parts flying in close formation. Foss looked out across the runway of Henderson Field, a generous name for a strip of dirt that looked more like a construction site abandoned halfway through the job. There were bomb craters filled with mud and piles of wreckage pushed to the side, the skeletons of other Wildcats that hadn't made it back. Everywhere there were Marines who were skinny, their uniforms hanging off their frames like scarecrows, sick with malaria and hungry. They were waiting for Tojo time. Every day at noon, like clockwork, the Japanese sent bombers escorted by swarms of Zero fighters flying down from their base at Rabaul to pound the Marines into the mud. They arrived at the same time every day because they were confident, knowing the Americans struggled to stop them and that the Marines were trapped. The situation on Guadalcanal was dire because the United States Navy had landed the Marines on the island in August. But then the Japanese Navy arrived in force. The American aircraft carriers, fearing destruction, pulled back and left the Marines stranded without steady supplies or reinforcements, clinging to a tiny perimeter around the airfield and surrounded by thousands of determined Japanese soldiers. The pilots of the Cactus Air Force, named after the island's code word, were the only shield the Marines had, but their shield was thin. They didn't have enough fuel. They didn't have enough ammunition, and worst of all, they didn't have enough planes. Foss watched his crew chief pull the chocks from the wheels, noticing the mechanic's grim face because he knew the truth. The engine had a cylinder barely holding pressure, and the radio only worked half the time, making sending a man up in this machine a gamble. But there was no choice because the radar shack had just reported a massive contact, 30 bombers and 20 Zeros 20 minutes out. Foss pushed the throttle forward, and the Pratt & Whitney engine roared with a deep, guttural sound like a chainsaw biting into metal. The plane shook violently because the F4F Wildcat was not a graceful machine. It was short, stubby, and broad-shouldered, like a beer keg with wings that waddled when it taxied. As Foss rolled down the bumpy dirt strip, bouncing over the ruts, he thought about what the experts said about this plane. Back in the States, engineers called the Wildcat rugged, and on the radio, Japanese pilots called it a target, but the Marines called it a tub. It was heavy and slow, pushing the air aside like a brick. Against the Japanese Zero, the Wildcat looked outclassed because the Mitsubishi Zero was light, fragile, and incredibly agile, able to turn sharply and climb quickly. If a Zero pilot wanted to dance, he could circle a Wildcat until the American lost his advantage. The Zero was a Ferrari compared to the Wildcat's dump truck. The Japanese knew it and mocked the Americans over open radio channels, breaking into Marine frequencies to laugh and ask where the Navy had gone. They called the Marines orphans and promised they would die on the rotting island where no one would ever find them. The mockery didn't just come from the enemy. It came from the situation itself because the pilots of the Cactus Air Force felt forgotten. They were flying planes salvaged from the boneyard, stripped from wrecks at the jungle's edge. Foss was flying an aircraft that was officially written off, a ghost machine, and he was about to take it into a swarm of some of the best pilots in the Japanese Navy. The wheels left the ground, and the heavy clunk of the landing gear retracting echoed through the cockpit as Foss climbed for altitude. In a Wildcat, altitude was life. If you were low and slow, you were dead, so you had to be high to turn the dump truck into a falling hammer. As he climbed past 10,000 feet, the air cooled and the swamp smell faded, replaced by ozone and exhaust. He looked around and saw other Wildcats clawing upward beside him, a ragged group in faded blue-gray paint and patched metal. Foss checked his .50 caliber machine guns, the one part of the plane he trusted, and charged them, listening to the sharp metallic snap. He checked his oxygen mask and his fuel gauge, which was lower than he liked, but on Guadalcanal it was always lower than you liked. At 20,000 feet, he saw them, silver shapes scattered against the blue sky. The Japanese formation was precise, bombers flying in disciplined V formations and Zeros weaving above and around them, clean and polished as if fresh from the factory. Foss felt anger rise in his chest, not fear but a cold, steady resolve, as he looked at the pristine Japanese planes and then at his own cracked dashboard. The Japanese had speed, numbers, and performance, but they didn't have desperation. Foss chewed on the end of his unlit cigar, keyed his microphone, and said, "Tally-ho, let's go get them," then pointed the nose of his heavy, ugly, battered plane straight at the lead bomber. He didn't care that the Zeros were diving on him or that he was outnumbered 4-1 because he was a Marine flying a coffin and intended to take the enemy with him. The Frankenstein fighter tipped over and began to dive, the engine screaming as the propeller bit into the thin air and wind roared over the patched bullet holes. The tub picked up speed and became a missile. The Japanese pilots likely laughed when they saw the clumsy Wildcats diving, assuming the Americans would try to turn and fight a fair battle. But Joe Foss wasn't interested in fair. He was interested in survival, and he was about to introduce the Imperial Navy to the one advantage a junkyard plane has over a Ferrari: it doesn't mind getting dented. To understand why Captain Joe Foss didn't pull out of that dive, you have to understand the metal wrapped around him. When the Japanese Zero pilots saw the stubby American plane coming head-on, they followed their training and held their triggers down, expecting the American aircraft to disintegrate. They were used to fighting planes built light, machines that tore apart under heavy fire. But the bullets from the Zero didn't rip the Wildcat apart. Many struck armor. The F4F Wildcat was built tough, with a heavy steel plate behind the pilot's seat. As Foss screamed toward the Japanese formation, he could hear enemy rounds hammering that armor like gravel on a tin roof, loud and violent but failing to break through. Foss kept his thumb on the trigger and watched his own tracers slash toward a Japanese plane built for speed over protection. The Zero's engineers had stripped away weight to maximize agility, leaving minimal armor. When Foss's .50 caliber rounds hit, they tore through critical structure, and the fighter broke apart in midair, trailing flame and smoke. Foss flew through the debris cloud, feeling fragments strike his wings and oil smear across his windshield, then pulled back on the stick, climbing for altitude. The so-called flying coffin had survived a head-on pass that could have ended it, proving the battered Wildcat could still fight. That durability wasn't accidental. It was one reason the Cactus Air Force endured, supported by mechanics at Henderson Field performing miracles with salvaged parts. Ground crews scavenged components from wrecks at the jungle's edge. If Foss's plane returned with a damaged tail, they might bolt on a replacement from another aircraft, creating patchwork machines held together by ingenuity and determination. One of the most important features was the fuel system. While many Japanese fighters used unprotected fuel tanks that could ignite when hit, the Wildcat employed self-sealing tanks lined with rubber that expanded when pierced, reducing fuel loss and fire risk. It was a practical solution that allowed a Wildcat to absorb punishment and keep flying. Japanese pilots nicknamed the Wildcats Grumman Iron works, because hitting them could feel like striking steel. But armor alone doesn't win fights. Tactics do. On Guadalcanal, tactics had to evolve quickly because traditional dogfighting methods proved dangerous against the agile Zero. The pilots of the Cactus Air Force stopped trying to outturn their opponents and instead fought with coordinated discipline, developing a maneuver known as the thatch weave. Two Wildcats flew as a pair. When a Zero latched onto one, the American pilot turned toward his wingman rather than away. The two fighters crossed paths, forcing the pursuing Zero into the sights of the second Wildcat. It was a trap that relied on teamwork and punished overcommitment. High above, Foss and his squadron used this weave to disrupt the Japanese formation, turning ordered ranks into twisting trails of smoke and tracers. The bombers began to scatter while Zeros tried to lure the Americans into turning contests, but the Marines refused. They dove, fired, and climbed again, using the Wildcat's weight to build speed in a dive that lighter fighters struggled to match. Foss spotted a Zero chasing a young lieutenant and rolled his fighter over, dropping fast to line up the shot. He walked his fire across the enemy aircraft until it trailed flame, then pulled up hard as G-forces pressed him into his seat. But the bombers were still pressing forward, determined to crater Henderson Field. Foss climbed again, engine temperature edging high and oil pressure wavering. The patched-together engine growled under strain, but it kept running. He found a Betty bomber and attacked from the side, pouring fire into the wing until smoke and flame erupted and the aircraft spiraled downward. Foss turned back toward Henderson Field as his fuel ran low, knowing the return could be as dangerous as the fight. Japanese fighters sometimes lurked near the airfield to strike landing planes. He lowered his gear, one wheel hesitating before he pumped the manual hydraulic handle until it locked into place with a metallic jolt. He lined up on the scarred dirt strip, weaving between fresh craters, and touched down hard, bouncing before braking to a stop near the runway's end. When the engine quit, he climbed out, looking at wings punched with holes and a battered rudder. The squadron commander drove up and asked how she flew. Foss answered, "Like a brick, but a brick that hits back." The raid was over for the day, and the attack had been turned back. But as the adrenaline faded, reality returned. Intelligence warned that heavier attacks were coming. That night, Japanese battleships positioned offshore and opened fire with massive naval guns. Shells weighing as much as small cars thundered into the perimeter, tearing into earth and airfield alike. For 90 minutes, the bombardment shook Henderson Field, the concussion so powerful they stunned men where they stood. The ground shook like an earthquake, and the aviation fuel dump erupted in a mushroom cloud. Captain Joe Foss huddled in a dugout, listening to shrapnel tear through trees and his precious Wildcats being smashed into scrap metal. When the sun rose, the airfield looked like the surface of the moon, a cratered wasteland of burning rubber and twisted aluminum where barely a dozen of the 40 fighters were flyable. Then the radar pinged because the Japanese weren't done. They sent a massive formation of Betty bombers escorted by Zeros to finish the job. Foss didn't wait for orders. He crawled out and saw the Seabees already bulldozing dirt into craters while bombs were still falling. He found a Wildcat that wasn't burning, a mess with a cracked canopy and scorched paint, but the engine turned over. He grabbed other pilots who could stand, siphoned gas from wrecks, scavenged ammunition, and hand-cranked the starters because the battery trucks were gone. This wasn't a military squadron launching. It was a junkyard gang preparing for a street fight. Foss taxied around bomb craters and bounced into the air, barely clearing the tree line as Japanese bombers dropped their payloads. He climbed, forcing the struggling heavy Wildcat higher despite clogged air filters and spiking engine temperatures, knowing he needed altitude. At 25,000 feet, he leveled off with his ragged formation, 4 battered Wildcats against a sky full of enemy planes. Foss had a plan. Ignore the Zeros and go after the bombers. The Japanese bombers were flying low and steady, confident the American air arm had been crushed, so Foss tipped his wing and dove. The weight of the Wildcat became a weapon as it dropped like a safe, building speed past 400 miles per hour and shaking violently. Foss ignored the vibration, lined up on the lead bomber, and disregarded the green tracers flashing past his canopy. At 200 yards, he squeezed the trigger, and the .50 caliber machine guns hammered the bomber's structure, tearing into the wing until it failed and sent the aircraft cartwheeling toward the jungle. Foss pulled up hard, G-forces slamming him into his seat, and checked his tail to see an angry Zero diving with cannons blazing. He heard 20mm shells striking his armor but didn't flee. Instead, he chopped the throttle and kicked the rudder, throwing the Wildcat into a violent skid. The aircraft yawed sharply, bleeding speed so abruptly that the fast-moving Zero overshot. In an instant, the hunter became the hunted, and Foss poured fire into the Zero's tail, shredding the lighter fighter. For the next hour, the sky became a barroom brawl at 20,000 feet, less about textbook maneuvers and more about instinct and nerve. Foss dove, fired, and climbed again, even as his aircraft grew heavier with damage and its controls felt sluggish. He saw another Wildcat trailing smoke and surrounded by 3 Zeros, so he turned toward the fight. Coming out of the sun, he shot 1 Zero apart, then faced the remaining 2 head-on. He committed to a closing pass at a combined speed approaching 600 miles per hour, firing as tracers stitched the air between them. At the last moment, the Japanese pilot broke upward, exposing his underside. Foss raked the Zero from nose to tail, igniting its fuel and turning it into a falling torch. When the surviving Japanese aircraft withdrew, Foss found himself alone in thinning sky with his fuel gauge near empty. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him gliding 10 miles from Henderson Field in a plane that did not glide well. He traded altitude for distance, keeping the nose down to maintain speed while the jungle canopy slid beneath him. The runway appeared ahead, narrow and scarred. He lowered the landing gear, hoping the hydraulics would cooperate until they locked with a heavy shudder. Crossing the tree line too fast, he flared hard and hit the dirt strip with a jolt, bouncing and skidding past fresh craters before stopping near the runway's end. Foss sat in the cockpit shaking, drenched in sweat and smelling of cordite and oil, staring at wings riddled with holes. The squadron commander ran up and asked if he was all right. Foss replied, "I'm fine, but this crate needs a drink." Mechanics towed the Wildcat away and counted more than 40 hits, astonished that the battered aircraft had brought its pilot home again. That night, the Japanese bombardment did not resume. The Cactus Air Force had made the price too high. The seasoned Japanese aviators had been bloodied by exhausted Marines flying patched-together planes. Foss lay in his bunk shivering from malaria yet smiling faintly, understanding the lesson. If you forced the fight on your terms and trusted your machine to endure, you could break even the best opponent. The Japanese had excellent aircraft, but they could not easily replace experienced pilots. As losses mounted, replacements arrived with less training, and the balance shifted. By January 1943, Captain Joe Foss looked gaunt, worn down by jungle heat and disease, having lost significant weight and aged beyond his years. When orders came to send him home, he resisted, reluctant to leave his squadron. Doctors insisted. He departed Guadalcanal credited with 26 aerial victories in roughly 3 months, tying a record that stood from the previous war. He had fought over a hostile jungle in aircraft held together by effort and improvisation, helping prove that resilience and teamwork could offset performance gaps. The American forces at Guadalcanal shot down hundreds of enemy aircraft during the campaign, and the struggle drained Japan of many experienced aviators it could not quickly replace. Foss returned to the United States, received the Medal of Honor, and traveled the country supporting the war effort. He often reminded factory workers that their craftsmanship, every rivet and weld, mattered to the men in combat. Yet he never forgot the boneyard at Henderson Field or the mechanics who patched bullet holes under fire, nor the pilots who did not return. The Wildcat's legacy endured in later rugged attack aircraft designed to absorb damage and keep fighting. Joe Foss went on to serve in public life, but he remained, at heart, a Marine fighter pilot who had flown head-on into overwhelming odds. The patched, oil-leaking plains of Guadalcanal helped hold the line at a critical moment, buying time and shifting momentum in the Pacific. We remember these stories not as statistics, but as reminders that determination, discipline, and teamwork can outweigh sleek design.